Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you're joining us because you're tackling challenging English texts, maybe getting ready for something important like a master's entrance exam perhaps, or maybe you just love digging into complex ideas and really, understanding them well, you're definitely in the right place.
That's right. Each time we take a source, we try to break it down, pull out the really essential insights. It's all about turning that dense material into clear, usable knowledge.
And building the skills to do it yourself too. That's key.
Absolutely. And today, we're diving deep into a specific text, Text 20. It's an excerpt titled Education, Productivity, and Economic Growth.
Okay, this one, it wades right into a topic that feels super important and honestly maybe something we think we already get. The link between more education and making a country, wealthier?
Seems straightforward.
But this author, they're going to challenge some pretty fundamental assumptions we might have, particularly when it comes to poorer countries.
Yeah, it's definitely a text that pushes you to think critically, especially about causality, like what really causes what, and, how fast can certain things, these interventions, actually make a difference.
So our mission today is to walk through this piece together, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence if we need to.
And really unpack the author's argument, yeah. Look at the evidence they use, how they structure their points, and definitely the crucial vocabulary and those sentence patterns that unlock the meaning. The kind of analysis that really helps you master the text.
Exactly. Think of it like a guided tour through the text. We'll point out the key stuff, talk about why maybe they chose certain words, break down those longer, trickier sentences so they make sense.
And show you how all these pieces fit together so you can really grasp the message and, confidently handle any questions about it.
Right. Let's jump in then.
Okay, paragraph 1. Straight away, the author signals their intent. Pretty strong opening statement. The relationship between formal education and economic growth in poor countries is widely misunderstood by economists and politicians alike.
Widely misunderstood.
Yeah.
Okay, wow. Right off the bat, you're not getting the standard view here.
Definitely not. They're saying there's a common mistake in how people, even experts, think about this.
Yeah, and they mention, that education progress and economic growth are both necessary for development. That seems, obvious, right?
Seems intuitive,
Yeah.
but then comes that turn, that pivot, introduced by that little word, however.
However, always a key word.
It really is doing some heavy lifting here. It sets up a contrast, doesn't it, with what came just before. The author lays out the conventional view, common belief.
Which is that education should be like the top priority.
Among the very highest priorities, they say, specifically for promoting rapid economic development in poor countries. And then, bam, they just flatly state this conventional view is wrong.
Wrong. Just like that. No messing around.
Nope. And they even add something kind of strange next. We are fortunate that it is.
Fortunate. Fortunate that the common belief on something so important is wrong. That sounds weird. Why fortunate?
Well, they explain it immediately after. The reason they say we're fortunate it's wrong is because building new educational systems there and putting enough people through them to improve economic performance would require 2 or 3 generations.
Okay. The time scale. That's the first big reason. So their argument against the usual view is basically it just takes too damn long.
Exactly. If your goal is rapid economic development, relying on completely rebuilding a whole education system, well, the author says that's a project for your grandkids, maybe great-grandkids.
So way too slow for rapid results.
Precisely. The focus here, you see, is specifically on that objective, rapid economic improvement in poor countries. They're not necessarily saying education isn't valuable long-term, just that it's not the quick fix for economic performance that people think it is.
Okay, got it. So if formal education isn't the fast track for quick growth, what's the alternative? They mention research findings, right?
Yes, they pivot straight to what the research has apparently shown. They state that research has consistently shown that workers in all countries can be trained on the job to achieve radically higher productivity and, as a result, radically higher standards of living.
Consistently shown. Okay, so suggesting strong evidence, repeated findings, and radically higher productivity, radically higher standards of living. Those strong words.
Very strong. They indicate a big impact, like transformative, not just a small bump. And the key phrase there is trained on the job.
Right. That's the alternative mechanism the author is proposing.
That seems to be it. For achieving that rapid economic improvement, they're saying focus on training workers right there in the workplace. This, they argue, can lead to major productivity jumps and better living standards much, much faster than waiting for the whole formal education system to catch up or be rebuilt.
Okay, so the core argument in paragraph 1 is basically challenge the standard idea. For quick economic growth in poor countries, prioritizing formal education doesn't work well because it's too slow. The author's alternative, backed by research apparently, is on-the-job training for faster productivity boosts and better lives.
Exactly. Understanding that central conflict, the conventional view versus the author's counter-argument and their reasoning, that's really the foundation for getting the rest of the article. You have to grasp that tension first.
It sets everything up. And thinking about, really understanding this text deeply, maybe like you need to for an exam. Look how a question might probe this. It might ask about the author's view on education's importance in poor countries in paragraph 1. Well, if they say the view that it's a very highest priority for promoting rapid economic development is wrong, what does that imply about its importance for that specific goal?
It implies that for rapid development, its importance has been, well, exaggerated, overestimated perhaps.
Yeah, overestimated sounds right. The author thinks the conventional view gives it too high a priority for that specific speedy outcome given how long it takes. So if you saw an answer choice like has been overestimated, it lines up perfectly with the author calling that view wrong in this context.
Exactly. It's nailing down the author's precise focus on rapid development, not some general statement about education being worthless.
Right. Or another question could ask what paragraph 1 says about building a new educational system. The text is super explicit there.
It is. It says it would require 2 or 3 generations. Plain as day.
So any answer option capturing that idea, long-time, multi-generational effort would be correct, just based purely on what the text states right there.
And these examples, they really show how focusing on the exact wording, the author's direct claims within just that paragraph, is so critical for answering comprehension questions accurately. It's about reading closely.
Okay, let's quickly zoom in on the language in this opening paragraph. We mentioned widely misunderstood and, however, anything else stand out in how they make their point?
Well, phrases like conventional view are important, right? They signal the author is positioning their argument against an established idea.
Sets up the debate.
Exactly. And words like priorities and promoting rapid economic development really narrow the focus. They're not critiquing education for all its purposes, just its role as a top priority for fast growth.
Gotcha.
And then you have the stark contrast between require 2 or 3 generations on one side and achieving radically higher productivity on the other. That really hammers home the difference in timescale and impact the author sees.
And radically itself, that suggests the impact of this on-the-job training is meant to be seen as, well, profound, not just a manner tweak.
Big difference, yeah. It underscores the significance of the alternative they're putting forward.
And what about sentence structure? We talked about that sentence. We are fortunate that it is because how does looking at its structure help us understand it better?
Oh, that's a great one. We are fortunate that it is because building new educational systems there and putting enough people through them to improve economic performance would require 2 or 3 generations. It's a perfect example of claim followed immediately by justification.
Okay.
The first bit, we are fortunate that it is, that's the author's feeling or claim about the conventional view being wrong. Then the second, much longer part, starting with because, gives the crucial reason why they feel fortunate, why they think the usual view is wrong for rapid development.
The because clause is the justification.
Exactly. And if you break down that because clause, the subject isn't just one word. It's the whole action of building new educational systems and putting enough people through them.
Right.
Those actions together
Would require the 2 or 3 generations.
Precisely. Seeing that those actions are the subject of the verb require helps you really grasp the author's point about the massive effort and time involved. It shows how they structure the sentence to directly link a consequence, being fortunate it's wrong, to its cause, because building systems takes too long. And this kind of sentence breakdown, identifying subjects, verbs, clauses, and their functions. This is a core skill for deeply understanding academic writing.
That makes sense. It's not just about grammar rules, but seeing how the structure itself delivers the argument. That structure puts the reason right next to the bold claim. Very direct.
Exactly. Guides the reader right through their justification for that quite controversial opening.
Okay, so the authors made a bold claim, given their initial reason timescale. Now, they need evidence, right? Paragraphs 2 and 3 seem to be where they bring in the real-world examples.
That's right. Paragraph 2 kicks off with the first piece of evidence, and it starts with a really interesting word, Ironically.
Ironically. Okay, that signals that whatever evidence is coming up is going to be sort of contrary to expectations, right?
Yeah.
Or what people thought at the time.
Precisely. It sets up a surprising contrast. The setting here is the U.S., specifically during a time when the U.S. economy was, well, struggling facing recession, and Japan was seen as being at its economic peak.
Okay, I remember hearing about that period.
And the irony comes from the common thinking back then. The U.S. workforce was derided as poorly educated and one of the primary causes of the poor U.S. economic performance.
So people were blaming U.S. workers' education levels for the economic problems.
Widely. Meanwhile, Japan was hailed as the global leader in productivity, especially in things like making cars.
Okay, so the narrative was U.S. workers poorly educated, low productivity. Japanese workers well-educated, super productive.
That was the perception, yeah. Formal education levels were taking the blame in the U.S., but the research the author cites, it found something surprising, something ironic given that whole background.
And that surprise finding was?
That the U.S. factories run by the big Japanese car companies, Honda, Nissan, Toyota, these factories, located in the U.S. with U.S. workers, they achieved about 95% of the productivity of their Japanese counterparts.
Whoa. Hold on. So the U.S. workers, the ones being called poorly educated and blamed for low productivity, they were working in factories that were almost as efficient, 95% as efficient as the factories in Japan, the supposed world leader.
That's the irony the author is highlighting, and the text is very clear about what the research said caused this high productivity. It was a result of the training that U.S. workers received on the job.
Bam. Okay, so this example directly hits their main point from paragraph 1, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that the on-the-job training, not the general formal education level, was the key thing allowing these workers to reach that radically higher productivity.
Exactly. It shows that even if a workforce is perceived as having, let's say, formal education deficits, specific workplace training can overcome that, at least for complex tasks like car manufacturing.
It's a really strong piece of evidence for their argument about productivity and on-the-job training. Challenges that simple link people make. More school automatically means better job performance right away.
It definitely complicates that picture. It's a powerful illustration.
And this example, again, thinking about comprehension, it helps clarify potential questions. Like, if you were asked about a major difference between the Japanese and U.S. workforces based only on this paragraph, what could you say?
Well, sticking strictly to the text, it gives that 95% figure. The U.S. factories reach 95% of their Japanese counterparts. That implies the Japanese factories were the benchmark, the 100% level.
So Japanese productivity was slightly higher in that comparison.
Based purely on that number, yes. So an answer saying the Japanese workforce was more productive would be directly supported by that 95% figure given in the text.
Right. You have to resist bringing in outside assumptions about discipline or organization or even overall education levels, because the text only gives us the perception, derided as poorly educated, and this specific productivity comparison.
Exactly. Stick to the evidence provided in the text. That's critical for accurate reading.
Got it. Okay, so that's the first example. Paragraph 3 offers a second one.
It does. Starts with more recently, which tells you it's a newer case, not just something from the past. This one's about building houses, housing construction down in Houston, Texas.
Okay. And the group of workers they focus on.
Described as illiterate, non-English speaking Mexican workers.
Okay, again, the author seems to be picking a group where, based on conventional thinking, you might predict, well, pretty low productivity. Illiteracy, language barrier, those sound like major hurdles.
Huge hurdles, you'd think. But despite those apparent barriers, the text says these workers consistently met best practice labor productivity standards.
Best practice standards, there's that phrase again, like the highest level.
Yep. It means they were performing at the top tier of efficiency for that industry, the building industry, which the text notes has its own complexity. So comparable to the most skilled workers, even though they couldn't read or speak English.
Wow. Okay, so this second example really hammers the point home, doesn't it?
It strongly reinforces it. Provides more evidence that those fundamental markers of formal education, like literacy and language skills, aren't necessarily absolute roadblocks to achieving high productivity and demanding practical jobs.
As long as
Effective on-the-job training and presumably good work methods are in place.
So both examples, the car factories and the construction site, they serve as these concrete illustrations of the author's main argument. You can get big productivity gains through specific applied workplace training, and you can get them potentially much faster than waiting for broad formal education levels to rise.
They provide the empirical grounding, the real-world data, to back up that initial claim from paragraph 1.
Let's look at the language in these two paragraphs again. Ironically, set the stage for the first one. More recently, transition smoothly to the second example, showing it's not just an old story. What about words like derided, or that phrase, best practice labor productivity standards?
Derided is important because it tells you about the negative perception of the U.S. workforce at that time. They were criticized, looked down upon. This makes the irony sharper when their actual productivity, with the right training, turned out to be so high.
Right, emphasizes the surprise.
And best practice labor productivity standards, that's a technical sounding term, but it's precise. It shows the Houston workers weren't just okay, they were performing at the peak level recognized in their industry. It quantifies their achievement in productivity terms.
And highlighting characteristics like illiterate and non-English speaking.
That strategically emphasizes the very factors that conventional wisdom might expect to limit productivity, making their high achievement even more striking support for the author's point about training being key.
Got it. It makes the evidence more persuasive for their specific argument. What about sentence structure in paragraph 2? There's that long sentence describing the research finding. Yet the research revealed that the U.S. factories of Honda, Nissan, and Toyota achieved about 95% of the productivity of their Japanese counterparts, a result of the training that U.S. workers received on the job. How does that structure work?
Yeah, that's a really effective structure. It starts with yet, signaling that the finding is contrary to the expectations set up earlier, blaming U.S. workers.
Okay.
The main clause is, the research revealed that something, and the crucial something, the direct object of revealed, is the whole clause that the U.S. factories achieved about 95% counterparts. That's the core finding.
And the part after the dash.
Right, a result of the training. That phrase functions as an explanation, or maybe in a positive, clarifying the finding. It tells you why or how they achieved that 95% productivity. The dash connects the achievement directly to its cause, making the link immediate and clear without needing a whole new sentence.
So it's like, here's the result, and here's the reason right next to it.
Exactly. Within that explanatory phrase, a result of explicitly flags the causal relationship productivity was the result of the training. And training that U.S. workers received on the job specifies the kind of training. So the whole structure presents the finding and its crucial explanation very efficiently and forcefully. Analyzing how that sentence is built really helps you see the author's logic and emphasis.
That makes a lot of sense. The dash isn't just punctuation, it's doing rhetorical work. Linking cause and effect tightly. Like you said, understanding that structure helps see the flow.
Precisely. It's about seeing how the author constructs their points.
Okay, so we've had the initial argument, the evidence focusing on the job training, boosting productivity. Now in paragraph 4, it feels like the author zooms out a bit, asks a bigger question.
They do. They transition with that question, what is the real relationship between education and economic development? This shifts the focus from just rapid productivity gains to the more fundamental, maybe historical connection between education and overall economic development.
Right. And they offer a hypothesis straight away. We have to suspect that continuing economic growth promotes the development of education even when governments don't force it.
This is a really significant idea they're putting out there because it suggests that economic growth isn't just something that results from education.
But it might actually drive the development of education, like growth comes first and education follows, maybe even naturally.
That's the implication. It kind of flips the usual script where we assume education has to come first, often pushed by the government, to kickstart growth. The author suggesting growth itself can create the conditions where education starts to flourish.
Interesting. And they use history to explore this. The ancestor example.
Yeah, the hunter-gatherers from 10,000 years ago. The text points out they didn't have time to wonder much about anything besides finding food. Survival took up all their energy.
Makes sense. Basic needs first.
But then, the crucial shift. Only when humanity began to get its food in a more productive way was there time for other things.
Getting food in a more productive way. Okay, that sounds like the very beginning of increased productivity, right? Like early economic progress.
Yeah.
Using less effort to get what you need to survive.
Exactly. It's that fundamental gain in efficiency, moving beyond just subsistence. And the direct result of this productivity gain
Was having time and energy freed up for other things.
And it's strongly implied that those other things include the beginnings of education, curiosity, knowledge, beyond just where the next meal is coming from.
So the historical picture they paint is, first came better productivity, which created a surplus of time, energy, maybe resources, and that made it possible for education to start developing.
That's the sequence the author suggests. It supports their hypothesis that economic progress can promote, or maybe even be a prerequisite for, educational development. It challenges the idea that education is always the starting point.
This historical angle is important, especially for understanding questions about this paragraph. If a question asks what the ancestor example shows, the text connects getting food more productively, which is basically an economic gain, not struggling constantly for food to having time for other things, which is where education emerges.
Right, so education's emergence is linked to solving that basic problem of subsistence efficiently. An answer choice connecting education's start to people no longer being solely focused on hunger due to productivity gains would align with the text's logic here.
Okay, let's look at the language in paragraph 4. It starts with, after all. What does that signal?
After all, often introduces something the writer thinks is kind of obvious, or a piece of common sense that backs up their point. Here, it suggests that the idea that education needs some level of economic stability or surplus to develop is, when you think about history, pretty intuitive.
Sort of like, think about it. This makes sense.
Yeah. And then only when.
That's a strong structure again.
Very strong.
Oh, boy.
Only when emphasizes that the development of those other things, including education, was conditional. It only happened after the condition of getting food more productively was met. It really highlights the cause and effect the author is trying to establish, putting the productivity gain firmly as the necessary first step in that sequence.
Okay. And what about the word choice in their hypothesis?
Here.
Continuing economic growth promotes the development of education. Why promotes instead of, say, causes?
That's a subtle but important distinction. Promotes is softer, less direct than causes. It suggests that growth encourages, fosters, or creates a fertile ground for education rather than being the single direct trigger.
So growth makes it possible, or likely.
Yeah, it enables the conditions. Maybe there's more money for schools, maybe people have more free time, maybe society values it more once basic needs are met. Promotes allows for other factors while still positioning growth as a key positive influence. It's a more nuanced description of what's likely a complex relationship.
Yeah, that feels more realistic than a simple A causes B. Okay, so we've got the initial argument, the productivity evidence, this historical hypothesis. Paragraph 5 seems to weave these threads together, adding more complexity.
It definitely does. It looks at the interplay, the sort of cyclical relationship. It starts by acknowledging the other side. As education improved, humanity's productivity potential increased as well.
So the author isn't dismissing education's role entirely. They're saying it boosts the potential for productivity.
Right. Getting more educated gives people skills that make higher productivity possible. But potential isn't the same as reality. The text then adds that the competitive environment pushed our ancestors to achieve that potential.
So you need potential from education, maybe, and some kind of pressure or incentive, competition to actually realize the productivity gains.
That's what's suggested. Potential needs a catalyst to become actual achievement. And then, looping back to the earlier point, achieving that potential productivity meant they could in turn afford more education.
Completing the cycle. So productivity gains resources for more education, higher productivity potential, maybe more gains if conditions are right, resources for even more education. It's like a feedback loop.
A dynamic, reciprocal relationship, exactly. But one where, again, the economic capacity being able to afford education seems crucial for keeping the cycle going upwards.
Then comes that very carefully phrased sentence, the one about advanced systems.
Yes, this is a really critical piece of nuance, the author writes. This increasingly high level of education is probably a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the complex political systems required by advanced economic performance.
Necessary, but not sufficient. We talked about this like flour for a cake. You need it, but it's not enough on its own. So applied here.
It means that for societies to develop those really sophisticated political structures and the highly advanced economies we see in, say, wealthy nations, a generally high level of formal education across the population is likely required. You probably can't get there without it. It's a necessary ingredient.
Yeah.
But just having a highly educated population doesn't automatically guarantee you'll get those complex political systems or that advanced economic performance. Other things need to be in place too. Maybe institutions, rule of law, specific economic policies, who knows. Education is necessary, but not enough by itself.
And the text links this specifically to the political systems needed for advanced economies. Interesting.
Yes, suggesting education might be crucial for enabling the kind of governance that underpins top-tier economic success. And they connect this to poverty traps.
Right, suggesting poor countries might not be able to escape their poverty traps without political changes that may be possible only with broader formal education.
So here, formal education potentially re-enters the picture as critical, but maybe for a different reason and on a longer timeline. Not for immediate productivity boosts, but for enabling the fundamental political and systemic shifts needed to break out of really deep, persistent poverty.
But notice the careful wording again, might not. May be possible only with. It's not stated as a definite fact.
Very cautious language. The author is presenting it as a plausible long-term role for education in facilitating those big systemic changes, but not a guaranteed one.
So, okay, education might be needed for the deep, long-term foundational changes linked to politics and escaping poverty traps. But then, the author immediately pivots back to their main point about near-term productivity in poor countries, doesn't he?
Yes, uses however again to signal that contrast, that return to the core argument. A lack of formal education, however, doesn't constrain the ability of the developing world's workforce to substantially improve productivity for the foreseeable future.
That sentence feels really important. It says, okay, maybe education is vital for the super long-run complex stuff. But right now, in developing countries, the absence of high formal education levels is not the main thing stopping workers from becoming significantly more productive in the short to medium term.
Exactly. You don't have to wait for everyone to get a degree to see substantial productivity improvements. That's the claim. The focus remains squarely on productivity as the achievable target for more rapid gains, and formal education levels aren't seen as the bottleneck for that, at least not yet.
And then they hit us with the final sentence, the big reversal, using that strong transition.
On the contrary, yeah, that tells you they're about to state the direct opposite of what you might assume.
And the assumption they're countering is?
The common idea that it's the lack of education that causes slow economic development and low productivity in poor countries. They flip it completely.
Ow.
They state, on the contrary, constraints on improving productivity explain why education isn't developing more quickly there than it is.
Whoa, okay, unpack that. It's not lack of education causing low productivity.
It's the barriers to improving productivity that are actually holding back education development.
So because productivity is stuck, the economy is stagnant, and therefore society doesn't have the resources, the time, the capacity, maybe even the demand to develop its education system faster.
That's the final causal argument. It reinforces that earlier hypothesis from paragraph 4, that growth promotes education and applies it directly to the situation in poor countries today. The implication is, if you can remove the roadblocks to productivity, you'll actually create the conditions for education to develop more rapidly as well.
Improve productivity first, and education development might follow more easily. That's a powerful final statement.
It really is. It brings the argument full circle, landing on productivity constraints as the primary explanation for slow progress on both fronts.
And understanding this final claim is crucial for questions about this paragraph, right? If asked about education development based on this last bit, that sentence implies that fixing productivity problems would allow education to develop faster.
Precisely. Education development, in this view, follows or is enabled by improved productivity. The final sentence is the key evidence for that interpretation within the text.
Let's quickly check the language in this final paragraph. We noted the transitions. As in turn, however, on the contrary, any other key terms jump out?
Well, productivity potential versus actual productivity achieved is important. Competitive environment as that catalyst, a forward-linking economic means directly to education. That phrase, necessary but not sufficient condition, is absolutely critical conceptual language. Then you have terms defining the higher levels, complex political systems, advanced economic performance. Poverty traps is specific jargon.
And constrain, meaning limit or hold back, substantially improve productivity, indicating a big jump is possible. And that qualifier at the end.
Foreseeable future. Yeah, that's important. It puts a time boundary on the claim that lack of education isn't the constraint for productivity. The author is focused on what's achievable relatively soon, acknowledging perhaps things change in the very distant future.
That's a subtle but significant hedge.
Okay, what about sentence structure here? That necessary but not sufficient sentence is a beast.
It is. This increasingly high level of education is probably a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the complex political systems required by advanced economic performance. The core is simple. Education is a condition.
Okay.
Everything else just modifies or specifies that. What education? This increasingly high level of education. What kind of condition? Probably a necessary, but not a sufficient one. A condition for what? For the complex political systems. What kind of systems? Those required by advanced economic performance. See how you can break it down layer by layer. Identifying what each phrase describes helps untangle all the qualifications the author uses to define education's role at that very high level. It's about tracing the modifications. Right, following the descriptive trail. It makes it less intimidating. And the final sentence structure. On the contrary, constraints on improving productivity explain why education isn't developing more quickly there than it is.
Classic cause and effect. The cause is constraints on improving productivity. That's the subject doing the action. The action is explain, the verb. And what do they explain? The effect, which is the whole clause, why education isn't developing more quickly there than it is. That why clause acts as the object of explain.
So the structure mirrors the causality. Cause, productivity constraints, explains effect, slow education development.
Exactly, and on the contrary flags this as the author's reverse view of causality. Understanding that structure helps lock down their final critical point.
Okay, wow. We've really gone through Text 20 quite thoroughly, paragraph by paragraph, looking at the argument, the language, structure, evidence. Let's try and synthesize it all now. Pull it together.
Sounds good. So the author of Text 20 fundamentally argues against that common belief, the conventional wisdom, that pushing formal education should be the absolute top priority if you want rapid economic growth in poor countries.
Right, mainly because building those systems and getting enough people through them just takes too long generations, they say.
Instead, they champion on-the-job training. They argue it's a much faster, more direct path to getting substantial improvements in how productive workers are, which leads to better living standards.
And they back this up with those real-world examples, the U.S. auto plants with Japanese management, the construction workers in Houston showing high productivity despite perceived or actual formal education limitations.
Then they offer that historical perspective, suggesting maybe economic progress, productivity gains actually came first and helped create the space for education to develop, kind of flipping the usual assumed direction of cause and effect.
But it's not totally simplistic. They add layers of complexity in the end. They acknowledge that a high level of formal education is probably necessary, though not sufficient on its own, for reaching those really advanced stages, like complex political systems and top-tier economies, the kind needed to escape deep poverty traps in the long run.
Crucially, though, they circle back to insist that for the foreseeable future, a lack of formal education is not the main thing holding back significant productivity improvements in the developing world.
And the final punchline. It's actually the constraints on improving productivity that are the real reason education isn't developing faster, implying that if you fix the productivity problems, education development might accelerate too.
That's the core argument laid out. It's quite a challenge to the standard way of thinking.
It really is. Now, stepping back and thinking critically, just based on the text itself, how convincing is the argument? What about the evidence?
Well, the evidence they provide, those two examples, is certainly illustrative and supports their point about achieving productivity via training. They're powerful anecdotes. But a critical reader might wonder, can you generalize from just those two specific cases? One involved foreign-owned factories with potentially unique management. The other was in construction. Do these apply across all industries, all kinds of jobs in all developing countries? The text doesn't give us broader evidence.
That's a fair point. The examples make the case, but their scope might be limited. What about the historical analogy, the hunter-gatherers?
It's a persuasive narrative device, for sure. It helps illustrate the idea that economic security might need to come before education takes off. But it's more of a conceptual sketch than, say, rigorous historical proof within the short text. It serves its purpose in illustrating the hypothesis.
And the text focuses so heavily on productivity, right? Specifically labor productivity in tasks. Does it really engage with all the other things formal education does, like fostering critical thinking, innovation beyond just doing a task better, social cohesion, scientific advancement?
That's a key point about the scope of this particular argument. The author here is laser-focused on the link between formal education and rapid labor productivity improvement and economic growth in poor countries. They aren't trying to give a full account of every single value or function of education in society.
So when analyzing this text, we need to recognize that specific, perhaps narrow focus. They're making a targeted claim about one relationship, not dismissing education entirely.
Exactly. And that's where that necessary but not sufficient point becomes so important, too. It shows the author does see a crucial enabling role for formal education, just maybe more for the long-term, high-level systemic development rather than the initial productivity spark.
Right. It prevents the argument from being just a simple, education doesn't matter. It's about when and how it matters most, according to this author. Less for the quick productivity jump, maybe more for building the foundations of an advanced society later on.
Precisely. Adds that essential layer of nuance.
This whole process we just went through, breaking down the claims, looking hard at the evidence, scrutinizing word choices, analyzing sentence structure not just for grammar but for logic and emphasis, and then stepping back to think critically about the scope and nuances. This is what mastering complex texts is all about. It's about actively wrestling with the author's thinking, not just passively reading, identifying the claims, the reasons, the evidence, the qualifications, and this skill. Well, it's obviously vital if you're preparing for something like a graduate entrance exam, but it's just as crucial for anyone who wants to be genuinely well-informed and understand complex arguments.
It shifts you from just recognizing words to understanding the architecture of the argument itself, how it's built, how well it stands up, based only on what the author has provided.
So, wrapping up text 20, the big takeaway. It's this strong challenge to a very common belief.
Yeah. It argues forcefully that for poor countries needing rapid improvement, focusing directly on workplace productivity via on-the-job training is likely more effective in the near term than pinning hopes on massive formal education reform, which takes generations.
And it floats that really provocative idea. Maybe economic growth and productivity gains actually help drive education development more than the other way around, at least in those initial stages.
It definitely makes you stop and reconsider a fundamental assumption. Instead of the usual, fix education first, then the economy will follow.
This text flips it, suggesting maybe we need to fix how work gets done, boost productivity first, and that will help create the conditions for education to flourish. And a really different perspective on the development path.
It shifts the immediate focus, the potential bottleneck from the classroom to the workplace, at least as the initial engine for change.
A really fascinating point to sit with. Keep that idea in mind as you read or hear other discussions about global development, education policy,
Yeah.
economic strategies. It gives you a different lens, a specific viewpoint drawn straight from this text we analyzed today.
Definitely. And hopefully this deep dive has armed you not just with the author's arguments from Text 20, but also with a clearer sense of how they built that argument, the evidence they used, and the nuances in their claims. You've seen the process of breaking it down.
Exactly. And remember, the more you practice this kind of deep, active engagement with challenging texts, the sharper your analytical skills become. Every complex article is a chance to learn more and get better at understanding. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.